You, TM, have ye heard the legends. Knights in armor, chivalry, glory. But nobody talks about October 25th, 1415, about what happens when 6,000 starving men face 20,000, about mud so thick it swallows horses, about arrows falling like rain until the sky goes dark. On a plowed field between two forests in northern France, Henry V is about to turn military logic upside down. His archers have no odumtukinioti eaten in days. They shit themselves from dysentery. The French nobles are betting on how many prisoners they will take. But something happens in that mud, something that changes warfare forever. What unfolds at Agincourt is no tiem t gloriose, ido tiems, calculated violence, desperation, and terrain used like a weapon. This is how the underdog wins. This is how an army dies standing up. Henry lands at Chefonceau in Normandy with roughly 12,000 men. Heo TMEs, 28 years old. His father seized the throne from Richard II. His legitimacy is shaky. He needs a win. He needs France to bend. He brings 2,300 men-at-arms and 9,000 archers. His target is Harfleur, the port that controls access to the Seine. Take it, and he has a foothold. Leave it, and the French control the coast. The siege begins August 18th. Thomas Duke of Clarence leads part of the force to the east side. The town is surrounded. Inside, 100 defenders grow to 400 when the Sieur d'Estouteville and the Sieur de Gaucourt arrive with reinforcements. Harfleur has 5,000 residents, stone walls, towers, water defenses that let defenders flood the land to the west. Henry brings 12 great guns, cannon, powder. Traditional siege engines. The Gesta Henrici Quinti, written by a chaplain in Henriot Tammy's household who was in the baggage train, describes how the bombardment within days causes massive damage to walls and towers, demolishing fine buildings almost to the middle of the town. The English dig mines under the walls, the French dig countermines, miners clash underground in the dark, the siege drags, heat. Thousands of men packed together with horses and waste, perfect conditions for infection. She believes these represent close maximums. Among the dead, Bishop Courtenay, Michael de la Pole, 2nd Earl of Suffolk. Lord John Harrington becomes sick with dysentery and is given permission to return home October 5th with 10 of his men-at-arms. The siege eats weeks. September 22nd, Harfleur surrenders. Henry leaves a garrison of 300 men-at-arms and 900 archers. He marches out October 8th with roughly 9,000 men. But many are still sick. Many want to tiem make Calais. The campaign season is ending. Winter is coming. He should go home. Instead, Henry decides to march his army 260 miles northeast through Normandy to Calais, the English stronghold on the coast. Ito TM's a statement, a demonstration, proof that he can move through French territory at will. Ito TM's also arrogance. The French shadow him. They know his route. They know his numbers. They know Heo TME's weak. Henry tries to cross the Somme River, but the French have fortified the crossing points. He detours inland, upstream. The delay costs him days. The French constable, Charles d'Albret, and Marshal Jean Lemangre, called Boucicaut, intercept him near Agincourt, October 24th. Henry has roughly 6,000 men left. Some sources say 9,000 left Harfleur, but disease kept spreading on the march. The most widely accepted modern figure, approximately 1,500 men-at-arms and 5,000 longbowmen. They OTM marched over 200 miles in 2.5 weeks. They OTM are suffering from dysentery. Many can barely walk. They OTM out of food. The French army assembles. Numbers are disputed. Traditional accounts say 20,000 to 30,000. Anne Curry, in her 2005 book Agincourt, A New History, argues 12,000 French against 9,000 English based on administrative records. Juliet Barker, Jonathan Sumption, and Clifford Rogers criticize Curry Oedwodauer TM's reliance on incomplete records. Multiple contemporary sources report the English outnumbered several times over. Bertrand Schnerb, professor of medieval history at the University of Lille, estimates 12,000 to 15,000 French troops. The conventional range, 20,000 to 25,000. The core is 10,000 heavily armored knights. Nobility, the best France has. They expect an easy victory. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Gesta Henrici Quinti, an eyewitness account written by a chaplain in King Henriot TM's household present at the battle, published by Oxford Medieval Texts, and Curio Harta TM's Agincourt, A New History from 2005, based on original administrative records in the National Archives, Jean Le Fricchevre de Saint-Remy, a Burgundian. Squire, who was present at the battle and wrote a detailed chronicle, on recent archaeological work by Tim Sutherland published in the Journal of Conflict Archaeology, showing that despite extensive surveys in 2015, no battle artifacts have been found at the traditionally identified site, leading Michael Livingston in his 2019 study published in the Journal of Medieval Military History to argue the battle occurred west of Agincourt based on terrain analysis. Now back to the information. They, TM, are confident. The nobles argue over who gets the best positions for capturing high-value English prisoners. Ransoms profit. The Duke of Orleans, the Constable d'Albret, and Marshal Boucicaut have drawn up a battle plan, but multiple factions argue over command. French nobles outrank the commanders. They disregard the plan. They focus on glory and ransom opportunities. October 25th, St. Crispino, TM's day. Dawn breaks cold and wet. Rain has been falling for days. The battlefield is a recently plowed field between two forests, Tramecourt on one side and Agincourt on the other. The strip is roughly 750 yards wide at the English position. It narrows as it approaches the French. Woods on both flanks prevent wide maneuvers. The field is mud, thick, clinging, energy-draining mud. 5,000 longbowmen. Sir Thomas Erpingham, an elderly veteran, commands the archers. The right wing is led by Edward, Duke of York, the center by Henry himself, the left wing by Baron Thomas Camoys. The English adopt their standard formation. Men-at-arms 4 ranks deep in the center, longbowmen on the flanks in wedge formations. The archers drive sharpened wooden stakes called palings into the ground at an angle. Protection against cavalry charges. The French form 3 battles, one behind the other, the vanguard packed with high nobility who want the glory of the first strike, the Constable Charles d'Albret, the Duke of Orleans, the Duke of Bourbon, the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Bar, the Duke of Brabant. 9 counts, 90 to 120 great lords and bannerets. Their archers and crossbowmen are pushed to the rear, rendered useless. Both armies stand for hours, waiting. The French 1-hour TMT attack. Henry is stuck. Every hour of delay favors the French, who are still receiving reinforcements. Around 11 in the morning, Henry makes his move. He orders his army to advance, banners raised, trumpets, the war cry, advance banners. Effective range of the English longbow, 250 to 350 yards. The Mary Rose shipwreck recovered over 137 intact longbows, showing draw weights from 100 to 185 pounds. Most cluster between 100 and 150 pounds. Contemporary accounts and modern tests confirm that with draw weights in the mid to upper range, heavy war arrows could kill or severely wound men in wrought iron armor at 240 yards. Steel armor offered better protection. Arrows were approximately 90 centimeters long with bodkin points designed to pierce mail and some plate armor. A skilled archer could lose 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Most historians estimate 6 arrows per minute as sustainable under battle conditions. 5,000 archers firing 6 arrows per minute, 30,000 arrows per minute. In 10 minutes, 300,000 arrows. The English had brought wagons full of them. Estimates suggest each archer carried 60 to 70 arrows. Sir Thomas Erpingham throws his baton in the air. The signal. 5,000 longbows draw. Release. The sky darkens. The first French cavalry charge begins, led by mounted knights. They advance across the muddy field toward the archers. The mud immediately works against them. Horses sink. Progress slows. Arrows rain down. Horses are hit. Riders thrown. The cavalry veers off from the stakes. Chaos. Most turn back before reaching the English line. Arrows can OTMT reliably pierce the best steel breastplates, but they penetrate limbs, joints, gaps in armor, horse flanks, and faces when visors are raised for visibility. The French raise their visors to see commands and show bravery. Jean de Warren, a medieval French chronicler who compiled detailed accounts, describes how the French begin to hold down their heads, especially those without shields, because of the impetuosity of the English. Arrows which fall so heavily that no one dares uncover or look up. They go forward a little, then retreat, but before they can close to hand combat, many are disabled and wounded. The French front ranks reach the English line exhausted. The narrow field compresses them. They cannot spread out. They cannot use their numbers. The Gesta Henrici Quinti describes them driven so close together that they cannot even raise their weapon arms. Heaps form. Men fall and are trampled. The French second ranks push forward into the backs of the first ranks, adding to the compression. The English men-at-arms fight shoulder to shoulder, 4 deep, stable, disciplined. They hold. The Gesta describes 3 great heaps of the slain around the 3 main English standards. Henry himself fights hand to hand. When his brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, is wounded in the groin, Henry takes his household guard and stands over Humphrey in the front rank until he can be dragged to safety. Henry receives an axe blow to the head that knocks off part of his crown helmet. The Duke of Alençon brings up his division to assist. He fights his way to Henry and is about to surrender directly to the king when Hio Bernard TM struck dead. The The Constable Charles d'Albret is killed. The Duke of Bar is killed. The Duke of Brabant is killed. The Second French battle joins the fight, but the compression and exhaustion work the same way. More heaps, more dead. The fighting lasts roughly 3 hours, though some accounts suggest as little as 30 minutes for the main slaughter. By early afternoon, the French first and second battles are destroyed. Thousands dead, thousands captured. The Third French battle hovers at the edge of the field, uncertain. They seize some of Henriot Roustortiem's treasures, including a crown and a precious sword. Reports reach Henry that his camp is under attack. At the same time, remnants of the French Third Battle attempt to reorganize. Several lords, including the Counts of Marlay and Fauconberg, gather 600 men-at-arms for a mounted charge. Henry looks at his exhausted men scattered across the field. He looks at the hundreds, possibly over 1,000 French prisoners his soldiers have taken. Noble prisoners, valuable prisoners, ransoms worth fortunes. He looks at the regrouping French, he calculates. His army is not in battle formation. His men are tired, wounded, scattered. The prisoners outnumber their captors. If the French rally, if the prisoners rearm themselves with weapons littering the field, the battle could restart with Henry. Surrounded. He gives the order. Kill the prisoners. Only the highest ranked are to be spared. The Duke of Orleans, the Duke of Bourbon, men whose ransoms are too valuable, but the rest must die. Jean Lefebvre de Saint-Remy, present at the battle, describes the prisoners cut to pieces, heads and faces. The only vulnerable spots on fully armored knights, helmets removed or visors lifted to stab through eye slits in their bassinets, cold-blooded slaughter. Gilbert de Lannoy, a 29-year-old French lord from the Pas de Calais, captured at the battle, later provides a detailed account. He survives. Many don't know TMT. How many die in the massacre? Unknown. Possibly hundreds. Possibly over 1,000. Contemporary sources don't know, TM, specify. The French Third Battle sees the killing. They disperse. The threat is over. Henry sends a herald to order them off the battlefield on pain of no quarter. They melt away. The English win. Total French casualties are difficult to know precisely, but may have been as high as 6,000 dead. Anne Curry suggests possibly 2,000 based on herald counts. Contemporary French sources report 3,069 knights and squires killed, plus at least 2,600 more corpses found without coats of arms to identify them. The casualty list reads like a roll call of French military and political leadership. 3 dukes dead, 9 counts dead, 1 viscount dead, an archbishop dead, the constable of France dead, an admiral dead, the master of crossbowmen David de Rambours dead along with 3 of his sons, the master of the royal household dead, 90 to 120 great lords and bannerets dead, entire noble families wiped out in the male line. In some regions, an entire generation of landed nobility annihilated. Claims of only 13 men-at-arms and 100-foot soldiers are almost certainly false. Henry deliberately concealed actual losses by paying retinues at pre-battle strengths and spreading the story of minimal casualties. One widely used estimate puts English losses at 450 men, not insignificant in an army of 6,000, but far less than the thousands the French lost. The Duke of York died trampled into the mud. The Earl of Suffolk died. Roughly 90 men from the Duke of Yorko to Tiem's retinue died, almost a quarter of his total force. At least 320 French prisoners are known from ransom records. Among the captives, Charles, Duke of Orleans, nephew of King Charles VI, who spends the next 25 years imprisoned in England, much of it in the Tower of London. John, Duke of Bourbon, Charles of Artois, Count of Eu, Louis, Count of Vendôme, Arthur, Count of Richmond, Marshal Boucicaut. The battle lasts perhaps 3 hours. The killing takes all afternoon. By dusk, Ito Thames over. The battlefield is carpeted with bodies, heaps of dead and dying. The mud is red. The smell is overwhelming. Professional teams boil the bodies of nobles to remove bones for easier transport home. The common dead are left. Some are buried in mass graves. In 1818, British officers attached to the Army of Occupation after the Napoleonic Wars excavate the site. They find a mass grave. They recover over 60 gold coins in high preservation, including French coins inscribed Carolus Dei Gratia Francorum Rex, Charles by Godot Tiems, Grace King of the French. They find armor fragments, weapon remains, arrowheads. But subsequent archaeological surveys struggle to find definitive battle evidence. Subscribe for more documented medieval history. Comment your city. In 2015, extensive fieldwork finds nothing attributable to the battle on the assumed battlefield. Tim Sutherland, a leading battlefield archaeology scholar, notes this is paradigmatic of medieval battlefield problems. Artifacts are small, valuable ones were picked up and sold, undistinguished ones corroded or were disturbed by farming. In 2019, Michael Livingston publishes research in the Journal of Medieval Military History arguing the battle could not have occurred at the traditional site, because the space is too narrow to fit even the smallest possible numbers of English soldiers. He proposes a site west of Agincourt. The exact location remains disputed. The terrain has changed little. The woods of Agincourt, Tremicourt, and Maisoncelles still define the general area, but 610 years later, the precise strip of mud where it happened is uncertain. What is certain is the outcome. Henry marches to Calais. The march is easy now, triumphant. He sails to England. November, he enters London in a magnificent procession. Choirs, maidens with tambourines, banners proclaiming him King of France. Captured French nobles parade through the streets before a Thanksgiving service at St. Paulo Stade, TMS Cathedral. Agincourt makes Henry a national hero. It cripples France. The Armagnac faction suffered the majority of casualties and carries the blame. The Burgundians seize the opportunity. Within 10 days of the battle, they muster armies and march on Paris. The lack of unity in France allows Henry 18 months to prepare for a renewed campaign. 1417. Henry returns to France. This time he conquers systematically. Normandy falls, he forces concessions. 1420, the Treaty of Troyes recognizes Henry as regent of France and heir to Charles VI. He marries Catherine de Valois, daughter of Charles VI. Héaulmé at the height of his power. He has everything he fought for. Then, 1422, Henry dies of camp fever near Paris. Héaulmé 35 years old. His infant son Henry VI inherits both the English and French thrones. But an infant cannot hold what a warrior won. France recovers. 1429, the Siege of Orleans, Joan of Arc. The French resurgence begins. The English advantage from Agincourt lasts 14 years, then it collapses. By 1453, the 100 Years' War ends. The English lose everything except Calais. Agincourt becomes legend, but its strategic gains evaporate. The longbow dominance fades. The Battle of Verneuil in 1424 sees longbowmen have their lines broken. The Battle of Patay in 1429 sees them completely routed, when French cavalry charges before they finish defensive preparations. Warfare evolves. Gunpowder artillery rises. The age of the knight in armor is ending, but it does no end at Agincourt. It ends slowly, battle by battle, decade by decade. The English had calculated it. They had the supply train. They had the doctrine. They been using longbow tactics for generations. Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, Halidon Hill in 1333, Falkirk in 1298. The longbow was not new at Agincourt. What was new was the desperation, the mud, the narrow field, the compression, the French mistakes. Henry did know to choose Agincourt. He was forced into it. He would have preferred to avoid battle or fight defensively like at Crécy. But the French blocked his path. His army was starving, sick, exhausted. He had no choice. So he used what he had. Terrain, stakes, archers, discipline, and it worked. But barely. If the French third battle had charged, if the prisoners had revolted, if the French had waited one more day for more reinforcements, if the rain had stopped and the field had dried, if the battle was closer than legend suggests. The English were lucky. Skilled, yes. Disciplined, yes. But also lucky. Together, they created a composite structure. Drawing a 150-pound bow required not just arm strength, but full body technique. Contemporary accounts describe English archers pushing their bodies into the bow rather than pulling the string. They trained from childhood. By adulthood, their skeletons showed distinctive asymmetric development. Left shoulders enlarged, left arms thickened, bone spurs on left wrists from the stress. Skeletal remains from the Mary Rose shipwreck, which sank in 1545 with hundreds of archers aboard, show these exact deformities. The Mary Rose bows had draw weights from 100 to 185 pounds. Most were between 100 and 150. Modern experimental archaeologists who train to shoot these weights report it takes years to build the necessary bone and tendon strength. Muscle alone is no TM enough. Unless you start young, really young, 7 or 8 years old, and you keep at it, you probably won't ever draw a 150-pound bow. The English systematized this. Edward I in 1285 began organizing archery training. By the 14th century, archery practice was mandatory on Sundays. Crossbows were banned for civilians to force longbow adoption. The investment was generational. You could create an army of longbowmen in a year or even 5 years. You needed a culture that trained boys from childhood and maintained that training into adulthood through constant practice. Against longbows firing 6 to 12 arrows per minute, the math did no TMT work. At Agincourt, the French crossbowmen were pushed to the rear by nobles who wanted the glory of the vanguard. They never got into the fight. The French also relied on heavy cavalry, knights in full plate armor on armored horses. In the right terrain, a cavalry charge was devastating, but Agincourt was no the right terrain. The mud neutralized the speed. The narrow field prevented flanking. The stakes stopped the horses, and once the knights were on foot in thick mud wearing 60 pounds of armor, they were exhausted before they even reached the English line. The English men-at-arms wore armor too, but they were fighting from a stable position. They were slogging through mud. Energy matters. Endurance matters. The French burned their energy crossing the field. The English conserved theirs waiting. When the sides met, the French were already beaten. If the battle restarted with prisoners loose and armed, the English could have been slaughtered. Henry made a calculated decision to eliminate the threat. It deprived his soldiers of ransoms worth fortunes. It violated chivalric codes. It was brutal, but it was effective. The Third French battle dispersed without fighting. The battle ended. Henry secured his victory. In 2010, a mock trial of Henry V was held in Washington, D.C. for the crimes associated with the prisoner slaughter. Justices Samuel Alito and Ruth Bader Ginsburg participated as judges. The trial ranged over just cause for war and the prisoner issue. Henry was unanimously found guilty based on evolving standards of civil society. An audience vote was too close to call, but by the standards of 1415, Henry acted within the norms of warfare when facing military necessity. Killing prisoners was not unheard of. At other battles in the 100 Years, TM, war prisoners were killed when commanders faced similar threats. The difference at Agincourt was scale. Hundreds, possibly over 1,000 prisoners killed. The wealth lost in unpaid ransoms was staggering. That bothered contemporaries more than the deaths themselves. The Saint Crispino Metropolitan TM's day speech. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. The speech is fiction. No contemporary source records Henry saying anything like it, but it captures something true about the battle, the sense of impossible odds, the unity required to overcome them, the shared blood, the bond. Shakespeare also depicts the prisoner massacre and Henry TM's justification. He shows the killing of boys in the English camp, though 15th century chronicles mention an attack on the baggage, but Donor TMIT associate it with any killings. Shakespeare invented or amplified that detail for dramatic effect. Laurence Olivier filmed Henry V in 1944, playing the Saint Crispino TM's day speech to World War II audiences as a rallying cry. Kenneth Branagh filmed it in 1989 with a grittier, more realistic tone. In 2019, Netflix released The King with Timothée Chalamet as Henry V. Each generation reinterprets Agincourt through its own lens. Sometimes TMs about English superiority over the French, sometimes about underdog triumph, sometimes about the horror of medieval warfare, sometimes about leadership and sacrifice. The battle means different things to different people, but the facts remain. October 25th, 1415, 6,000 English, 20,000 French, mud, longbows, compression, exhaustion, slaughter. By nightfall, thousands of Franceaux or TM's best knights and nobles are dead. The English have won one of history, TM's most improbable victories, and the myth begins. A peasant archer trained from childhood could kill a knight whose armor and warhorse cost the equivalent of a modern luxury car. Birth and wealth did no TM protect you from a bodkin point arrow traveling at 160 kilometers per hour. The social implications were profound. Knights trained their entire lives for combat. They came from the nobility. They were the warrior class. Then along comes a commoner with a stick and a string who can punch through your armor from 200 meters away. The knightly class did not TM disappear immediately, but their monopoly on military effectiveness was broken. Agincourt demonstrated this brutally. The best knights in France, the cream of the nobility, marched into a field and were massacred by men who worked farms and practiced archery on Sundays. Class inversion. The high brought low, literally into the mud. It took decades for the full implications to unfold, but Agincourt was a turning point. Not the turning point. One of many. Crécy before it, Bataille after it. But Agincourt was the most dramatic, the most improbable, the most legendary, and so it stuck in memory while other battles faded. Married to the French princess, regent, legitimate. Everything he invaded for in 1415. But he died 2 years later at 35. Camp fever. Dysentery, probably. The same disease that killed thousands at Harfleur, the same disease his army suffered from at Agincourt. It finally got him. His son, Henry VI, was 9 months old when he inherited both thrones. The dual monarchy was doomed. An infant could no Tiamat rule. Regents squabbled. France recovered. Joan of Arc rallied French forces at Orleans in 1429. The tide turned. By 1453, the English had lost everything they owned TMDD gained. Agincourt bought Henry 14 years of dominance. Then it evaporated. Was it worth it? 6,000 English starved and diseased, facing 20,000 French. Hundreds of English dead. Thousands of French dead. Entire noble families exterminated. For what? 14 years of control before losing it all. The strategic calculus is harsh, but legend does no temeti to care about strategic calculus. Legend cares about the moment, the impossible odds, the muddy field, the rain of arrows, the heaps of dead, the underdog winning. The totem says what survives. Between Agincourt and Tramecourt, somewhere in those fields. Walk the ground today in Eto'o Tien means quiet, peaceful, rural France. Hard to imagine it was once a killing field. In 1818, British officers dug and found that mass grave. 60 gold coins, armor fragments, proof that men died here. But where exactly? Recent archaeology has failed to pinpoint it. Michael Livingstone, or TM's, research suggests the traditional site is wrong, too narrow. The battle probably happened further west, maybe. The ground has been farmed for 600 years, plowed and replanted annually. Artifacts get dispersed, buried deeper, destroyed. Metal detecting helps, but also displaces evidence. The context is lost. We know there was a battle. We know roughly where. We know approximately how many died. We know the outcome. But the precise details, the exact location, the moment-by-moment sequence, remain partly obscured by time and by the limitations of the sources. 7 contemporary accounts survive, 3 from eyewitnesses. The Gesta Henrici Quinti by the chaplain. Jean Lefricchefre de Saint-Remy, who was there. Anonymous others. They agree on the broad strokes. They disagree on details. Numbers vary. Timelines differ. Motivations are interpreted differently. That Otenotm's history, fragments, pieces, reconstructions, best guesses. The field was already narrow. Henry just used what he had. He positioned his army to maximize advantage and minimize the French advantage. Basic tactics, but executed perfectly under desperate circumstances. The French made mistakes, disorganized command, nobles arguing over glory and position, ignoring the battle plan, pushing archers to the rear, charging into a narrow, muddy field against entrenched archers and stakes, overconfidence. They expected easy victory. They bet on prisoners and ransoms. They got slaughter. Command and control matter. Discipline matters. Coordination matters. The French had numbers and equipment. The English had discipline and terrain. Discipline and terrain won. Ito versus Tietzems, a lesson repeated throughout military history. Thermopylae, Cannae, Alesia, Agincourt. An inferior force using terrain and discipline defeats a superior force lacking coordination. Not always. Usually the bigger army wins. But sometimes the underdog has a chance. Agincourt was one of those times. Archers were commoners, but they were experienced. Many had fought in previous campaigns. This was no empty their first battle. They knew what they were doing. They knew their craft. Draw, loose, 6 times a minute for 10 minutes, 60 arrows. Then pick up a mallet and wade into the melee. Kill exhausted Frenchmen stuck in the mud. Efficient, brutal, effective. They were no tempties, fighting for glory. They were fighting for pay and survival. The glory came later. The legend came later. After the battle was won, and the songs were written, and Shakespeare penned his play, and generations retold the story. In the moment it was mud and blood and arrows and fear. They fought because they had no choice. Trapped, outnumbered, starving, fight or die. So they fought, and they won, and that unlikely victory became legend. 610 years ago, on a strip of mud in northern France, an army of sick, starving English archers destroyed the flower of French chivalry. The mud helped, the longbow helped, discipline helped, luck helped. But what really won was desperation channeled through training in terrain into focused violence. 30,000 arrows per minute falling on men who could know TMT maneuver, could know TMT spread out, could know TM and use their numbers. Compression, exhaustion, heaps of the dead, 3 hours of slaughter, then silence, then the prisoner massacre, then victory, then legend. The facts are cold, the legend is warm. That Tao TMs. How history works. We remember the story, we forget the smell, the mud, the shit from dysentery, the screams, the dying. We remember the underdog victory. We forget that victory cost thousands of lives and bought only 14 years of advantage before everything collapsed. But Agincourt endures, in memory, in culture, in myth, because sometimes the story matters more than the outcome. Juliet Barker and others pushed back, arguing her numbers undercount because records are incomplete. The debate continues. Maybe the French had 12,000, maybe 25,000. It changes the narrative, but not the outcome. The English won. Numbers matter for understanding how and why, but the result is the same. More important than exact numbers is understanding the system. How the English recruited, trained, supplied, and deployed longbowmen. How the indenture system worked. How logistics functioned. How arrows were manufactured and transported. How tactics evolved. That OTM's where the real story is. Not in one battle, but in the decades of development that made Agincourt possible. The English did no TMT stumble into that victory. They built a military system designed to produce exactly that outcome. When conditions aligned, when terrain and weather and French mistakes converged, the system worked perfectly. Once at Agincourt. The other adapts. The English had dominated with the longbow for a century. Then the French figured out counters, combined arms, gunpowder, better coordination. The longbow did know TMEMT disappear immediately, but its dominance faded. By the early 1500s, handguns and cannon were replacing bows. Easier to train, more powerful, louder, less dependent on individual skill. The age of the archer ended. The age of gunpowder rose. Agincourt was near the peak of longbow effectiveness, one of the last great bow victories. After that, guns. Put someone in 60 pounds of armor and have them walk through thick mud for 300 yards. By the time they reach the end, they are gasping, exhausted, barely able to lift their arms. Now have them fight. Impossible. The French knights who reached the English line had already spent all their energy just getting there. They were dead men walking, or standing, or collapsing in heaps. The English, fighting from stable ground, were fresh by comparison. They could fight for hours. The French could fight for minutes. Energy expenditure decided the battle as much as arrows or terrain. The French burned their stamina crossing the field. The English conserved theirs. When the lines met, it was no even close. Featured testimony and arguments about international law, just war theory, and the laws of armed conflict. Justices Alito and Ginsburg presided. The prosecution argued Henry violated laws of war by ordering the prisoner massacre. The defense argued military necessity and the standards of the time. The jury of audience members could no TM reach a verdict. The judges found Henry guilty based on modern evolving standards. TM's an interesting exercise, applying modern law to medieval actions. By today OTM standards, Henry committed a war crime. By 1415 OTM standards, he made a hard choice under pressure. Both can be true. The moral calculus changes with time and context. What matters is understanding why he did it, what the circumstances were, and what the consequences were. Not whether we approve 6 centuries later. Agincourt transformed Henry from a questionable successor to a legendary king, from a man whose father OTM's usurpation shadowed his legitimacy to the warrior king who defeated France against impossible odds. It gave him the political capital to conquer Normandy, force the Treaty of Troyes, and marry into the French royal family. It made him untouchable in England. His early death at 35 preserved the legend. He died at the peak of his power, undefeated, having achieved everything he set out to do. No time for decline or failure. No time for his achievements to unravel while he was alive. He became frozen in victory, the perfect heroic king. His son inherited the problems. The impossible task of maintaining what Henry had won and failed. But the failure belongs to Henry VI, not Henry V. The legend of Agincourt remains untarnished. The underdog victory, the impossible win, the band of brothers on St. Crispino TM's day. That story, real or embellished, factual or mythic, endures. Heaps of bodies. Ito, TM, is almost impossible. The gap between then and now is too wide. We have photographs, we have film, we have detailed documentation. Medieval people had chronicles and eyewitness accounts, and sometimes not even that. Agincourt is well documented by medieval standards, 7 contemporary accounts, 3 eyewitnesses. But even with that, huge questions remain. Exact location uncertain, exact numbers debated, exact sequence unclear. We reconstruct from fragments. We interpret, we guess, we argue. And 610 years later, we are still trying to understand exactly what happened on that muddy field in October 1415. The English were led by King Henry V. The French were led by Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut. The English used longbows, terrain, and discipline to overcome superior numbers. The French suffered catastrophic casualties, possibly 6,000 dead, including much of their nobility. The English suffered relatively light casualties, possibly 450 dead. Henry ordered the massacre of French prisoners during the battle due to perceived threat of renewed attack. The victory allowed Henry to conquer Normandy and ultimately secure the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, making him heir to the French throne. He died in 1422. His infant son could not hold the gains. By 1453, the English had lost everything except Calais. The battle became legendary, immortalized by Shakespeare in countless retellings. It remains one of the most famous battles in history, studied for tactics, analyzed for technology, debated for ethics, and remembered for its improbable outcome. Most were buried in mass graves that have since been lost to time and plowing. Some were taken home as bones after being boiled. Most were no TTT. They remain somewhere in those fields, anonymous, forgotten except in aggregate. 6,000 French dead, nobles and commoners alike. They died for dynastic politics, for claims to thrones, for abstract rights and legal arguments. They died because their commanders were disorganized and overconfident. They died because the mud was too thick, and the field was too narrow, and the arrows were too many. They died for nothing that lasted. 14 years later, the English lost what they OTM to won. The sacrifice was wasted, but that OTM's warfare. Most sacrifice is wasted. Most victories are temporary. Most blood is spilled for causes that don't OTM.tia endure. Agincourt is no different, except in memory. In memory, it endures. The mud, the arrows, the impossible odds, the victory. That story survives when everything else is lost. Killing each other because kings and nobles decided territories and thrones were worth dying for. The English won. France lost an entire generation of leadership. Henry gained a kingdom he would lose and die before he could truly hold it. And 610 years later, we still tell the story because sometimes the underdog wins. And when they do, we remember. We remember because it gives us hope. Hope that against impossible odds, victory is still possible. That skill and discipline and luck can overcome numbers and wealth and power. That the starving can defeat the strong. That the few can triumph over the many. That OTM's the story of Agincourt. That OTM's why it matters. Not because it changed history, though it did for a moment, but because it changed what we believe is possible. On a muddy field in France, 6,000 men prove that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible happens. And we never forget it.